Great. It is an absolute honor and pleasure to be here at MIT again to discuss how AI is shaping the future of business. But before I go any further, wasn't yesterday an awesome day? International Women's Day. Woo! It was just so inspirational, and we've done so much. I know all the companies, as you know, it's not a one-time activity. It's not one day a year. It's an everyday thing. And I've been very involved at IBM with that, as well as diversity and inclusion. LGBT+, I'm one of our key sponsors. And it just yesterday brought it all together. So again, it was a really momentous time, and we should all be so proud that that type of action is being taken around the world. So with that, I was here and had the privilege 4 years ago to talk to the Sloan graduate students. And there were probably about 50 students, and it was the year 2014. And we had just started the IBM Watson AI unit, we call it Watson. And it was a really riveting time because, you know, back then, think about 4 years ago, although it's a blur in a lot of respects, but we were just starting thinking about how AI can be applied. And since then, I've been to 31 countries. I've met with hundreds of organizations, government organizations, and it's just incredible what's happened with AI and how it's being applied. It's still early, but there's just so much progress. And if I were to leave you with one thing today in my presentation, it's 2019 is AI goes into production. And the reason why I feel that way is, again, you look at all the industries, there's been thousands and thousands of implementations of AI, very simple. Again, it's not the panacea to solve everything. It really, very pragmatically, there's been so much advancement in the technology and the way society is adopted. There's some countries where they have aging population problems, so they've been more aggressive in how they're adopting and embracing this technology. Others don't. There's been industries that are very digital today in terms of they've been transforming digitally for many years, like banking and financial services. Others are a little behind. So there's kind of that country or geography lens, there's the industry lens, and ultimately there's that country lens and in the corporation lens that you have to look through. So what I wanted to do in my 30 minutes is talk about 3 areas. The first area is to just talk about AI and some of the evolution, talk about data and how that's impacting it, and then coming back to some of the key challenges. I mean, as you know, as much as I'm super excited and bullish, no question, this is going to be the year AI goes into production, there's also some very, very challenging things that we need to address. Explainability of AI, removing bias from AI. AI is fragile. So there's a lot of those types of topics, and I'm going to go into a little more detail a bit later, but that's something that we all have to rally together, all the companies, government organizations, and work together, because this is, as much as it's an impact on business, it's an impact on society. And we all have a responsibility to usher this next era of knowledge responsibly. And it's not one company, it's everybody together that's going to make the difference. So here's the historical context of what I wanted to start with. Over the last 60 years, there's only been 2 times when technology has changed in such a way that it's allowed businesses to grow exponentially. The first was Moore's Law. You all know what Moore's Law is. Processing power doubles every 18 months, and it allowed us to put compute everywhere. The next time was Metcalfe's Law, which basically said the value of the network is equal to the square of the nodes. And that gave rise to platform companies, think Google. So there's no doubt that those periods have had a profound impact and will continue. But we think we're in a very special moment now, and it's this next era around knowledge and learning that's going to have as profound an impact as the prior 2. And with that, at IBM, we've been spending a lot of time just looking at, again, the business problems and looking at the technology and how to bring it together. And over the last 5 years, I've personally been involved with many of these engagements. And you know, I wanted to really just frame out what are some of those examples. So for today, I wanted to do 2 things fundamentally. After we talk about the AI, I want to also give you some real examples of how companies, and you're going to hear from my friend a little later, Russ Woodside, and give you some other examples of how it's really being applied today. And then lastly, again, in my travels, 31 countries in the last several years, I wanted to just share with you, if you ask me, what are your 5 top lessons learned? I want to share that with you. And then if we have time for questions, or even if we don't have time, maybe later in the day, I'd love to just hear from all of you, because I know some of you out there represent companies and have a lot of experience like me as well. So I'd love to just collaborate. I was in Europe recently and had a discussion with some journalists, and it was an interesting discussion. It was about, is AI being adopted? Is it happening? And my personal view is absolutely, it's here. It's not a matter of whether or not AI is going to happen. It's happening. Back to the earlier point, it's at what speed is it going to happen? What adoption level? So at this point, I mean, just look at your phones today, or when you woke up. How many times did you interact with different applications? Whether it be some of the everyday applications, you think at Alexa and Siri, whether you're interacting with your bank, whether you're using Waze maybe for navigation. There's just so many ways it's being used today in everyday life. And then you extend that to the business world. And there's lots of opportunities, and there's lots of examples about how it's being used. So again, it's not a matter of is it going to happen. It's happening. It gets back to the acceptance and the adoption and the speed of that in society. I think the other part that makes it really interesting as well is just if you look at, you've seen traditionally a consumer market and an enterprise market. And I think we've seen a lot of graying over the last 4 years of those two areas, those two frontiers, so to speak. Because now what you do at home, how you act at home, you're bringing that hyper-personalization in the way you behave and the way you interact to work. And so if you're an enterprise, a company, and you're interacting with your customers, they've received an amazing experience, that customer journey. So it's been very much a digital, outside-in view to these companies. So as a company, you're going to have to really adjust and make sure that you can understand how your customers and consumers want to interact with you. And on the flip side of that, if I'm a company, you also have to look at your competitors. There's so much competition in all these spaces, both the traditional incumbents as well as the startups. And that's good for everybody because it's going to put pressure on the system to make sure that we continue to innovate at the levels we need to innovate. Data. Did you know that 20% of the world's data is searchable via the web? Only 20%. The other 80% sits behind the 4 walls of companies and government organizations. And the problem we're trying to solve is, as you all know, I mean, just think about the IoT sensors, billions and billions of sensors. There's so much information, so much data, humanity doesn't know what to do with it. And it's not like we've been sitting around for the last several years. There's a lot of great products and software tools, advanced analytics, to help us make sense of it. On top of that, you've also got the issue of accessibility of the data. When you think about the so-called invisible data or dark data, they say that over 88% of the data is invisible or dark. It's not being utilized, so it's basically being wasted because traditional programmable systems can't access that data. You need machine learning and AI to be able to access that information to get the insight and knowledge that's going to be critical to be successful. So the data component, and I'll talk a little later about those lessons learned, and that's just a huge area, is really understanding the importance of data and how the data can be used. At IBM, we have a saying that you can't have AI without IA, information architecture. And the reason why we believe that is because it's just the traditional way of managing the data has given us great opportunities to better leverage it, but there's a lot of new ways and techniques, especially as we have to prepare that data to be used in these AI models. And so we have what we call an AI ladder, which is nothing more than just a framework that we typically use when engaging with our customers. And that is basically to collect the data, to organize the data, analyze the data, and infuse the data with AI. And if you think of that whole model, it's almost like a supply chain from end to end. Then you've got to look at how do you utilize the data, how do you consume it, and how do you leverage that data to make sense of it. And then every step of the way, you need to make sure you have trust and transparency. Because back to my earlier comment, that's a top of mind right now, understandably, as to how I do that. And then the last piece of it is containers. Containers are really the foundational component of this new data architecture as we move forward. And if you think of it, it's almost like having the opportunity to take all these data services, think like ETL, and moving those into microservices. So think of like a cloud-native architecture running containers. So the key benefit of containers is really going to be able to give you multi-cloud, where you can build it once and run it everywhere. So there's been a lot of advancement, and there's a lot of open solutions out there. And at IBM, we have our recently announced AI, or I should say Watson OpenScale, which is one way of managing all this from all the way from the beginning, the build, the run, and the manage. So if we think of the data as the fuel to the engine, AI is the engine. And I know there's a lot of different probably definitions and perspectives, but I just wanted to start out with, I think, a fairly straightforward one, and that is, as we all know, the fundamental field of AI is really using neural networks and other techniques to learn from the data in real time, right? Learn from the data in real time, and these machines draw inferences like humans draw inferences. They do deductive reasoning. They can do inductive reasoning, at some point, abductive reasoning. And if you look at the core fundamentals of it, in systems like Watson, they understand the data. So you think of natural language processing and corpus of information and processing it all. You understand it, you reason, you apply reasoning engines and algorithms to make sense of the data, to reach conclusions. You learn from the data. Systems like Watson never forget, and they're always learning, and that's important because we always want to improve. And lastly, to interact. And we want to interact and make sure we can interact with people in natural language ways. If we look at the different types of how this can be applied, there's a couple different ways today. The first is, if you look at AI in the most common uses, we're looking at for image detection, visual recognition, speech transcription, language translation. And this is basically a single task in a single domain, and that's referred to as narrow AI. And there's lots of applications. Think about customer care or cognitive care, call it what you want, IoT, and virtual automation. So a lot of different applications. And to the earlier point, this is spread like wildfire. There's lots and lots, thousands and thousands of examples of how this technology can be used in the form of applications. The next piece is the broader AI. And this is where you get into more of the multi-task, multi-domain. And as you see on the chart, we're really at the beginning stages in our view at IBM. And the reason being is there's some pretty big hurdles that we need to overcome together across all the different companies. And that is, when you look at the challenges, there's probably three I would just tee up front. The first is explainability of AI, right? It's amazing what it can do. These neural networks will continue to get better and smarter and do much more. But a lot of the consumers, a lot of the customers want to know what's exactly happening in those neural networks. They want to see more traceability so they understand what happens from end to end. The second challenge is AI is fragile. You can inject noise, as you know, in these systems, and you could trick it to think a bus is a giraffe. And then when you up the scale and you start looking at these neural networks and you want to really create more intrusive behavior, you really have a very, very difficult time trying to manage it all. So security has never been more important, making sure these systems are secure to the core. And then the last is ethics in AI. And really that comes back to the bias is such a big focus. And that is, as these systems go through and make these decisions and run the algorithms, how do you know it's not bias? I mean, we'll talk a little later about the data. The data could have bias to begin with. And then you're just pumping biased data into a new system. You're not really improving things. So you really have to look at, as you run these networks and you look at the data being pumped through the systems and understanding, is there bias? Like, can you provide explanations as they're being made? Can you flag where there are potential issues? And then how do you correct or mitigate those bias decisions? So there's a lot to do there. So at IBM, again, we just released our Watson OpenScale, and I'll give you a quick example. So let's just say you're an insurance company, and you're doing claims processing, and you're using AI for the claims processing. You have a system that will go through all the information, and that system basically is recommending to the claim processor that even though it seems like all the boxes are checked off or ticked off to give that person to process it, the claim, they're saying they're basically recommending to reject it. So if you're a claims processor, you need to make a decision. Do I reject it or not? At a minimum, you need to understand what was the explanation? Why is it recommending you potentially reject it? And that's going to be important, not just for customers, but in some industries, you could have a regulator asking you. So there's a couple different features in our Watson OpenScale. The first is just the explainability. So as you go through that process, you need to be able to tell that customer or that regulator how it arrived at those decisions, and do it in very simple language, not super technical language, but in everyday language to make sure it's clear how that claims processor can explain it. The second is a traceability. How do you know what happened end to end as you curated the data, worked it through the algorithms, and ultimately it went to that decision point? So we can trace it. We have capabilities to trace it every step of the way and look at all the data and information that was used by the AI. And then the third is where there is potentially a case of harmful bias, being able to, in real time as these decisions are being made, to flag it, understand it, and to automatically correct the bias or mitigate the bias. So it's very powerful. Again, this is always going to evolve. There's other things like learning from small data sets. So there's lots of other things out there. I just started with those three because those are probably, as I travel, those are three that seem every conversation. It's the explainability, right? It's fragile. And it's how do I know I'm not injecting bias into these types of systems? So let me run through a couple of examples. Again, I'm around the rest of the day and happy to go through more details. But Crédit Mutuel is one of the largest banks in France. We've had the pleasure of working with them for several years now. And like any example, and you'll hear it at the end when I talk about lessons learned, but with this technology, it's awesome. But you always have to articulate what is the business problem we're trying to solve, right? I understand and respect, and Russ, same thing at Woodside 4 years ago in Australia when we were thinking about this with your CEO on the board. But you absolutely are going to continuously do experimentation. But you also need to think about what is the practical business application. Because for this to really have an impact in your organization or if you're a startup, wherever you sit in the ecosystem, you're going to want to scale these systems. These are not one and done type systems. These are something that you want to put into production, and you've got to figure out how to scale these systems. So with Crédit Mutuel, they have over 12 million customers, 20,000 employees, 5,000 branches. And the problem they were trying to solve is there was a lot of increased competition, and they knew they had to innovate in different ways. And we looked jointly across all the different initiatives and some of the business pain points and problems. And one of the areas is they were trying to get more efficiency and drive out some of the mundane day-to-day activities. And the way we did that first use case was what we call the email analyzer. So they receive over 350,000 emails a day. And so we applied Watson to basically go through all those emails and understand the intent, the prioritization, and then ultimately how to respond to those emails. And we've had great success, and it's freed up over 200,000 person hours a year. And with that, they've been able to plow those hours in the form of the people back into other strategic areas, into education and other parts of the business. So that's just one example. Crédit Mutuel is also using it as an agent assist, so internally for their advisors, like a lot of companies. I'll give you a quick example. When I was in Brazil at Bradesco, they had a similar solution to Crédit Mutuel, but their challenge was they did a big acquisition. So their average agent in one of the retail branches of banking, they now, instead of being experts in 4 products, they had to be experts in 60 products. So how do you scale that? And similar to Crédit Mutuel, it's the same type of thing. They're in a lot of different insurance products, home insurance, auto insurance, et cetera, as well as some of the investments and saving plans. So they wanted to create that more knowledgeable agent so that when they're consulting, so it's an agent assist, so when they're servicing or consulting with their customers, they'll have much more knowledge. You notice I didn't say we're replacing, right? We're absolutely going to drive productivity, but it's an agent assist. It's helping that agent be more effective and making sure they focus on not only streamlining the business processes, but also help them hopefully have opportunities to cross-sell and upsell and grow top-line revenue. And then the last part with Credit Mutuel, which is important, which is applicable to many of these examples, is back to my earlier point about when you think of the data, if you have biased data and you feed it into the models, that you're almost making things worse. So that's why we have solutions like a Watson OpenScale to help with that. But the other part of it is you want this data and these algorithms to help you reimagine the way work gets done. If it's just garbage in, garbage out, that's not really helping. So Credit Mutuel and the other examples I'll run through have these processes where they go through and we look at, through automation and other techniques, that we are truly redefining and reimagining the way work gets done. Instead of going A to Z, maybe it goes A to H. And that's a great opportunity to really rethink your business models and how you can drive greater efficiencies and ultimately be much more competitive. Autodesk, I think all of you are probably familiar with Autodesk, but again, great software company, and they've always been excelling at customer service. Now their problem was they were switching from like an on-premise type of software to a software as a service model, so to a SaaS model. So they have over 1.2 million inquiries from customers and partners every year. And they were challenged because now with business picking up as it was, they also had the added complexity of supporting a SaaS model where it would be more 24/7 and scaling up that expertise. So they really needed to get a better handle on how to keep up with the increased business, as well as some of the new business model in terms of the processes I alluded to earlier. So they went from ideation to production in about 3 months. I'll note that they did a lot of this themselves. They had their own data scientists and other capability in-house. And just in the time they've implemented, as you can see, they've improved the response times in terms of resolution of issues by 99%, and their customer satisfaction has gone up 10 points. So they're continuing to roll it out. Back to my earlier point, whether it be Credit Mutuel, Bradesco, or Autodesk, scaling is going to be really, really important, and leveraging those tools to always try to go faster and scale that expertise in the organization. RBS, Royal Bank of Scotland. For those of you familiar with the UK market, it is the most disruptive traditional banking market in the world. 15% of the revenue and a third of the new revenue is coming from new entrants. So banks like RBS have a real challenge because there's a lot of startups, there's a lot of competitors in those local markets that they wanted to really innovate and improve the experience. We've been working with them for about 3 years now. We have 9 different use cases of AI in Watson. 7 are in production, so to speak. And they're using it in the first part. I'll give you a couple examples. First is Cora, and Cora is being used for the customers. So it's a self-service type of feature, and customers can interact directly with Cora and frequently asked questions, as well as some long-tail questions, some more difficult discovery types of interactions with customers. Marge is another chatbot internally. It's really a intelligent virtual agent. It's much more than just a bot. And they're using that internally. Back to the point, like with Credit Mutuel and Bradesco, they want to give the opportunity to the representative in the bank, in this case, Home Mortgages, to be more knowledgeable about their products from a business process perspective. They want to try to automate as much as possible and go paperless at some point when you think of that whole mortgage processing end-to-end spectrum. And so they're using this with Marge to start that journey. And they're also using it for HR, supply chain, procurement, again, many other uses. And I start there because there's this perception that it's all about call centers. It's much more than just call centers. These virtual agents can span many different functions in organizations to drive the value that's expected. So with that, again, been very active the last 4 years and met with hundreds of organizations. And if you ask me, no right or wrong, point blank, what are your 5 biggest lessons learned? These would be them. So the first one is just around AI. We talked earlier, again, I'm very bullish on it. I think we've seen tremendous impact on how it can impact not just business, but society. So the first part, well, it took too long. It takes a long time. You have to ingest it. But I'd go back to these are knowledge systems. These are not plug-and-play systems that you just turn on and all of a sudden they can perform. In the most basic sense, I mean, these systems, they learn a profession, right? A banker, an insurance agent, an oncologist. So you need to train it, and they get smarter and smarter, and they never forget as they go along. Some people don't understand that. Some people think they should come with a higher level of intelligence and efficacy and don't appreciate that these are knowledge management systems. So the good news is, back to my earlier point about being a blur the last 4 years, so much advancement, and now there are a lot of great tools that we have. I mentioned earlier, we have a Watson Studio that helps you build. We have a Watson Machine Learning to help you run, and then we have this Watson OpenScale, which helps you manage it. So there's a lot of great capabilities out there to go faster, but that was absolutely something early on, as we know, Russ, at Woodside, 4 years ago, there was a lot of curation of the data, there was a lot of unknowns at times, but we wanted to be a first mover, and it's paid off in a big way, and I know you'll talk about that later. The next is modernizing your data estate, and that's similar to what we were talking about earlier with the containers and the fact that data is data. I've been doing this a long time, and I go back to the old ERP days of SAP, Oracle, others. But data's always been a gorilla to tackle at times. And now with the sheer volume of data, it's not just the velocity of the data. Again, it's the sources, it's the types of data that inform the decisions we make. So it's a lot of different variables, and we talked about the invisible data. So really just having a strong data strategy. There's a lot of great tools out in the marketplace, but really just thinking through it. Because if you don't get this right, you're going to really be challenged. Because in particular, I mentioned a couple of times the whole bias, right? If you have bad data that's biased and you're pumping it through the system, it's only going to get worse, not better. So you really have to understand how that gets done. The third is skills. And you've heard at times there's a debate, man versus machine. At IBM, we're very much in the man and machine. All these case studies or use cases I just shared. It's about working together, man and machine, and we think there's great opportunities to do so much more. But when you look fundamentally at the skills, there's a skills shortage, right? Will jobs be replaced? Maybe single digits. Will 100% of the jobs be impacted due to AI? Absolutely. That's a good thing because we're transforming businesses. We're disrupting at times industries to think about things differently. That's no different than the last couple hundred years. I mean, that's innovation. That's how it evolves. But the point on skills is absolutely critical. Data scientists and all these others, and it's not just the hardcore science skills, it's also on the other side, on the business skills and the change management in other areas, because this is, if you do this, like we've done at Woodside and some of these others, I mean, it's as much organizational, cultural, as it is on the technology, and to have that combination and make sure you have the right skills in place. At IBM, we created what we called an AI Academy, which we've used internally and we're using externally just because we realize it. And there's a lot of other companies doing the same thing. Because in the end, our strong belief is, from an educational perspective, we all have a responsibility to make sure that we're leaving no one behind when it comes back to the workforce of tomorrow and the education required. The fourth is value, the business value. And again, if you ask me the one that probably is my pet peeve, it's this one. Because there's times when clients will say, well, let's just get started. And absolutely, we can get started. I mean, the great thing is you can build applications like that, have it in production in 30 days, and we've come so far. But other times, when it's in the core part of your business, supply chain or finance or maybe in the customer service area, you really have to understand what's the problem we're trying to solve. Because there's a lot of other great capabilities out there, and you might not need to go so heavy or deep, so to speak, in AI. There might be other ways to leverage it. So I would just encourage, when you undertake these projects, doesn't matter if you're small, medium, large, doesn't matter if you're a government organization, any industry, it just comes back to take a deep breath and say, what's the business problem we're trying to solve? Where are we today? Where do we need to be? And how do these different technologies help us? And the only other point I would stress is that it's not necessarily your traditional operational KPIs and say, okay, shareholder value or optimization. What are those things that we tick off? Absolutely, those are there. But there's new ways of also measuring value, and it's more qualitative than quantitative. So just be balanced and don't go so heavy on just the quantitative, because there's a lot of new ways to measure customer experience and customer engagement than just the hardcore traditional measurements. And then we've also seen NPS and other measurements that are absolutely critical as we move forward as well. So it's really that combination. And then the last part is just around, it's more than AI. Again, AI is not the panacea. It's not going to solve everything. Absolutely positively, this is the year AI goes into production. Am I saying it does everything? No. But there's a tremendous value. There's thousands and thousands of proof points of what it can do. And I would just say that in most implementations, it's not just AI. Maybe it's analytics. There's a lot of data strategy. There's a lot of other components that together make it more successful. And that's another key learning over the last 4.5, 5 years is it's just, again, it's not the silver bullet to say you do AI and everything works. AI is absolutely the centerpiece in a lot of cases, but there's all these other peripheral capabilities and services and solutions that together will bring you even more benefit and give you that competitive advantage. So with that, I know I'm out of time, but good news is it's the last slide. So I wanted to leave you with four thoughts. So the first is, back to my earlier point, we talked about Moore's Law, Metcalfe's Law, and this era of learning and knowledge. This is going to be as profound as the prior, and I think it's going to give us a great opportunity. We've already seen a lot of this transformation in industries. Again, I gave you the geography view, the industry view, and at a company level. You can either, if you're a company, do it and be a first mover, a fast follower, or you're going to be a laggard. And I'd be worried if I'm a laggard, because the way this technology is moving and disrupting, you need to be out in the front. Two is, it's going to have as transformational an impact in terms of AI as the internet did 20 years ago. I mentioned a couple of these points earlier, but I would just stress that there's cultural aspects, there's the skills aspect, there's the educational aspect. Again, we cannot leave people behind. We have to continue to innovate and work together to make sure that we're equipping the workforce of tomorrow. And we all have that responsibility of stewardship. We also have to continue to set these ethical guideposts. It's our responsibility. This stuff will not get done with you. There was a recent survey out of our IBM Business Value Institute, and it said that 92% of global executives are expecting more regulation as it relates to AI ethics. So there's going to continue to be that push. And then lastly, the trust and transparency. I mean, that is just so much of all of this in terms of the integrity to be able to use this technology in a responsible way. And then lastly is, a lot of people ask, well, how do we get started? And there's a lot of ways you can get started. I just put up there a couple different ways, because you really want to go quick and get the benefit. And we see implementations in 30, 60 days. So, there's agile ways of thinking. In the past, we've used Lean and Six Sigma. Design thinking is a great way to get started. You iterate many times. And most recently, we've seen incredible popularity of garages over the last 12 months. Because, it's just a great way to co-create. And then much like we did at Woodside, right? We got our teams together. We took them out of the business and IT functions, brought them together. We iterated. And we had several MVPs teed up. We prioritized. We did one. We iterated. Some of them worked. Some of them didn't. That's OK, because you're moving at such a pace that it's OK to fail. If you fail fast, because you really want to drive significant change, not incremental change. So with that, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. And again, it's been an absolute pleasure to spend time with you today. And I would just say that we all have a responsibility. This isn't about one company or another company. This is such a tremendous opportunity for all of us, and as global citizens, we all need to come together and do our jobs and make sure we usher in this next era of learning in AI in a responsible way. Thank you.